Welcome, welcome to our AirMiners event on COP29. My name is Jason Grillo with AirMiners. It's a pleasure to see you all here. We had some amazing outcomes come out of COP29 for international carbon credit trading markets. And what we want to do today is unpack some of those about Article 6.2, Article 6.4, and other things that came out of the Conference of Parties conference in Baku, Azerbaijan. What I'm going to do today is, first of all, give a little bit of background about Article 6.2 and 6.4 to those who are just a little bit new to the mechanisms in play, one, and then introduce you to our amazing panel and moderator. We've got Tamme, Helen, Bray, Olga, Gassan-zade, and Sebastian Manhart, who will be moderating the event. As you typically do in AirMiners, what we're going to do is have a discussion for about 45 minutes or so, and then go to Q&A. And then after that, we'll stop the recording and have a half-hour networking session afterwards for people to talk about what we heard, and have an opportunity for people to get to know each other, not just know of each other. So what I want to do is make sure that you are learning what is important to you from Article 6.2, 6.4. If you have questions in the about the discussion, please put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them over the course of the Q&A. Excited to be here. What I'm going to do now is share my screen, which is something we don't normally do in AirMiners, but I do want to show just a really quick overview of Article 6.2 and 6.4 for the sake of those who are a little bit new to it. So Article 6.2 had been ratified earlier as part of the Paris Agreement, which includes bilateral and multilateral agreements on a decentralized mechanism. So these are internationally traded mitigation outcomes that happen under Article 6.2. There's one such one in place right now. It has to go from country to country, from organization to organization. One from, I believe, from Switzerland to Ghana. So how to trade those mitigation outcomes. Article 6.4 enables a more broad outcome for the carbon markets in that it's an international market. It's going to have a registry, it's going to have methodologies, it's going to have all sorts of mechanisms that the UN itself will maintain in order to govern the trading of credits from projects between entities. And it's a more robust framework rather than kind of one-off here and there between entity to entity and company to company, which is what Article 6.2 was. So that's some of the context. Getting 6.4 over the line was a monumental effort. It took almost a decade to have it happen. So it's very exciting times for those of us who are working in carbon removal credit markets. With that, I'm going to, with that overview, say once again, thank you to you for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists for coming. And without any further ado, Sebastian Manhart, please.
Thank you, Jason, and real pleasure to be here. So nice to see that so many people showed up for a panel that I was very excited about, because I'm going to learn so much in the next hour, as I hope everyone here is. Sebastian Manhart, I run policy at Carbonfuture. We build digital infrastructure to scale high-quality carbon removals. We're obviously very interested in the topic of Article 6 as well. And I'm going to hand it over just for a quick round of intro with the speakers in a second, but maybe just to set the context, I think everyone here, or most of us, will already have read quite a bit about what happened, right? And there have been positive stories, there have been negative stories, there have been concerns, there have been people celebrating. There's been a lot of different opinions on the same outcome. And what we hope to do today is to really from the three people, it's quite funny because I wanted to organize a webinar and I had like, who are the three people I want to invite? And they were exactly these three people. And then I reached out to them and they were like, actually, AirMiners just asked us to do the same thing. So we clearly thought the same thing because you three are the three people you would want on this webinar. And we're going to kind of move from, we're just going to have a free-flowing discussion, to be honest. We thought that this is actually the most useful given the people we have in this panel. But we're going to focus a little bit on kind of what's happened, right? And what exactly does it mean? What are some of the details? But then we're also really going to focus on some of the questions that where I guess there's been different perspectives on it and try to disentangle a little bit the more complicated, the nuances of Article 6.2 and 6.4. We're not going to cover COP in general, some of the financing that's maybe in a side note, but our focus is really on Article 6, 6.2 and 6.4 in particular, just to give a little bit of scope to this discussion because otherwise it's way too much for 1 hour. And yeah, as was already said, please do share your questions. We're going to try to just feed them into the discussion as we go along. And at the end, we're also going to have some dedicated time if needed. Before we dive in, maybe from top to bottom on my end, Eva, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Very happy to be here. Thanks, Jason and AirMiners for inviting. Thanks, Sebastian, for moderating. My name is Eva Tamme, and I am a climate policy expert working specifically on carbon capture, carbon removal, and carbon markets. So very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Maybe Olga, or yeah. You're next on my screen. Do you want to go
Right.
next?
My name is Olga Gassan-zade, and I am a climate policy and carbon markets expert. I've been working in this for 20 years, and I've been Article 6 negotiator from Glasgow to Bonn this year. And I'm member of Article 6.4 Supervisory Body and its former chair.
Hi, I'm Helen from Puro, a carbon crediting platform for durable carbon removals. And I'm pretty much the same version of Eva and Olga. I have looked at carbon markets for over 20 years, and I'm always here. I'm here to help businesses understand what governments need, to help governments understand what business needs. And I'm super excited to join today's event and have a discussion with you. Thank you.
Wonderful. So maybe to get us started again, let's focus first to give everyone also the right context a little bit on what exactly happened. And so maybe if you think about, with regards to Article 6.2 and 4, what happened at COP29, were you surprised? Was it what you expected? Yeah, maybe we can just start there and then move on. So yeah, whoever wants to go first, just jump in.
Okay, shall I get started? I mean, the question, was it what we expected? I think this is what this was what we hoped, right? And I'm just so relieved that we got these results, because having another year of trying, but still failing would have basically, I mean, the whole hope that these markets will actually properly pick up, especially 6.4. I mean, that's just, no one would take it seriously anymore. I think it was about time it worked. And to a large extent, to the COP presidency, who really set out to say that they want to prioritize this. They did a lot of heavy lifting making it happen. They had this kind of unconventional way of, on the first day of COP, approving the standards of the Paris Agreement Credit Mechanism, which obviously is kind of a great thing to kick us off. But then the fact that in the end we had this CMA decisions on both, maybe that wasn't necessarily a given until quite the last moment, but we got there. Such a long road that we finally managed to kind of get to the end of. Yes, we should celebrate. This is huge. The markets under the Paris Agreement are now operational, and yeah, it's time to get started with scaling them, right, and putting everything in place that we need.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, Eva, so when you look at what is the purpose of Article 6 in general, it's given the label of international cooperation. This is how the world can get to net zero emissions quicker and at lower cost. The ultimate goal of Article 6, which doesn't actually mention the word markets, but that's the point of it. So to have agreement and clarity, especially on how countries will trade, and that's what 6.2 is mainly around, and having more detailed rules so that more investment can flow, is a really good outcome. And then also having the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism with a sign of approval that removals are an activity that is seen as essential for net zero is something that, for people who've been watching this and monitoring it for, 10 years is really important. And then now, obviously, we need to look at what that means on the ground and what it means in real life, and happy to have that conversation. But we should just take a moment, because what was really fascinating about COP is it felt like an implementation COP. Lots of countries talking about how they're going to implement it, what's going to happen, how they're going to work with different projects, what that means for trade. And those are the really fascinating conversations that we enjoyed to have when we were there. Thank you.
And yeah, everyone just feel free to jump in, Olga, whenever you want. I guess one thing that I wanted to pick up on also from you, we hear it's now operational. And I think this can be confusing to people, because what does operational mean, right? Because there will be people in this room who think like, it's operational, great, I'll start trying to get my project certified and sell into 6.4, whatever it's going to be tomorrow. I know that's not what you mean, but I think it's confusing when people hear operational. So it would be great to understand, what does it mean? Like, where does 6.2 and 6.4, maybe we can touch on each, where do they stand today? Like, what is already functioning? What is missing? What does it take to become fully functioning? Because yeah, at least I know that from my side, there's definitely been some confusion on this. Yeah, maybe Olga, do you want to go first?
Why don't we divide? Because I can talk about 6.2. Maybe Olga wants to talk about 6.4, for example. Because I'm mindful that she hasn't yet taken the floor. But on 6.2, obviously this was operational before, but what we got from this COP was some decisions on elements that so far were the cause of a lot of uncertainty for market players. And now actually we have the rule book that is more or less complete that we needed. So basically, for 6.2, the fact that we know now the rules on revocation of authorization, we know what the registry will look like, and all of this. That's something that was missing, also the reporting parts, and now we have it, so we can kind of go ahead and start using it already, knowing exactly how these rules look like. Because before, those who started using this mechanism, they were kind of already establishing all the documentation and the projects, but not really knowing if something still comes from the rulebook that somehow doesn't work for them, right? And now that kind of fear is gone. Maybe some things will need to be adjusted here and there, but we have those missing parts of the Article 6 rulebook. Over to someone else on 6.4.
Right. Well, I can add, and I can also comment on the first question. Of course, there's Article 6 community as negotiators and experts. We were not surprised. I mean, it was well overdue. We didn't get an outcome in Dubai, but what we got here is more detailed. This thing is better. It's very hard for a lot of countries to come together and agree on certain things, on rules and how it impacts them. So when we finally got that agreement, and it's sort of the end stage of us sort of really detailing that rule book on Article 6, that was very good. 6.4, and actually, both 6.4 and 6.2 were already operational. Just there were certain hanging out issues that, they were like on reporting and review on the UN level, on the registries, on some of the authorization. So there were details that were actually, they were leaving an impression that market was not operational because there's certain things that haven't yet been resolved. But the market was already operational, 6.2 and 6.4 as well, because 6.4, all the procedures 6.4 were closed. Majority of them were closed last year. what was missing was the standards, which were approved before they were called recommendations. So they returned it to standards. They were approved in October. And actually, they didn't require CMA's approval, but they did require some sort of reaction from CMA because, you know, the SBM, the supervisory body, reports to the conference of parties. And we got that reaction on Monday, the opening day, which is indeed was an excellent move from the presidency to remove that from sort of the drama of the last day, which usually is a drama, you know. I mean, I don't know if people are new to this or not, but that's, I mean, what has happened was was very normal for a COP. You know, methodologies can be submitted to 6.4. There'll be projects that will be transitioning. You know, 6.4 is the mechanism, we call it Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. But in effect, it's a certification standard. And I see questions already on whether it regulates verifiers. Yes, it regulates verifiers. It regulates verification process, qualifications, reviews of verifiers. It will regulate methodologies, and it will have an impact on the voluntary carbon market because it will have an impact on all of the independent certification standards. Maybe I'll stop here and then we can take more questions.
I think there are a lot of things to go deeper on what you just said, but I'm wondering, Helen, did you want to also comment anything from your end on this? Okay, then
maybe
Olga,
I'll jump in
yeah.
with something because I was really interested in what Olga said, because so far I had lived in the reality where 6.2 was operational and 6.4 was not. And now I just learned that actually 6.4 was also operational for a while already. We just had not realized it because we assumed that the fact that these standards or what used to be recommendations had not been endorsed, that was basically the big hurdle that we had to get over. And apparently that wasn't the case. So I'm happy I learned something new today.
And Olga, if I can ask also, I had my own questions, but I see that in the chat there's actually others there as well. With regards to the methodologies that now need to be submitted, because if I understand it correctly, if for specific technologies, specific removals, for example, we're still missing the methodologies for those specific technologies or approaches, and they have to be submitted and worked through by your team. So can you maybe just explain a little bit what that looks like? Like if you are, can you just submit these methodologies right now? Where do you send them? How long will it take until, say, direct air capture methodology submitted to you guys will actually be functional and you can start certifying direct air capture units under the Article 6.4? Just as an example, it could be any technology.
Well, there's procedure. If you go to the 6.4's website, you know, the rules and procedures, I think, or regulatory framework, I'm not sure what it's called, but you will find there the standards and the procedures, and there's procedure for submission and evaluation of methodologies that you can read through and understand better. I see a good question from Chetan on, you know, that the requirements that concern additionality, baseline leakage, and all of that, they're still not yet approved, and it's true. They're still in elaboration. I do think that it's important for it's important that working methodologies and sort of, you know, because it takes time, you know, to prepare methodology. You need to have a sort of a project. If my memory is correct, you need to have a sample project that you're going to be presenting with a methodology. It, you know, you will have to take something specific and then follow the procedure and submit and have an interaction with the secretariat. If they say that, it's too premature, then then you would know. But in my view, the standards right now are already very, very clear on most of the things. And there'll be additional standards coming, but they are not. But they shouldn't be stopping people from starting to work the mechanism. That's maybe a short summary.
And can I maybe, looking to you, Helen, I mean, as obviously Puro is in the business of developing methodologies, right? So I'm just wondering, when you are looking at this, and I'm also curious how different, I also saw this in the chat, for example, how this could link, how these methodologies could align with CSCF, for example, VCM methodologies. How do you see this kind of emergence of all these different layers of methodologies that are being created? And also, how you're thinking as a VCM player, how you're going to interact with this new mechanism?
Yeah, no, I like that question, and I want you to hold me to making sure I answer it and I make sense. So please make sure I'm clear. So Pure Earth mainly operates in the voluntary carbon market, but what we're seeing now with carbon markets is they are accepting credits from the voluntary carbon market if they meet certain criteria. And the clear example of that is the aviation market, so the carbon offsetting reduction scheme for international aviation, or the Singapore carbon tax are two of them that spring to mind. We're also seeing that governments are developing protocols for durable carbon removal. This is a good thing for the sector. So we've seen that Japan has just come out with its DAX protocol. Canada will be coming out with theirs soon. The EU has got a draft BECS and DAX and biochar methodologies. So it's a really exciting time for the sector as governments start to implement methodologies. And what we do at Pure Earth is we talk to governments and we find where we have space to operate. And for us, Article 6, which is about trade between countries or into the aviation market, you can use the standards of the voluntary carbon market. So countries can decide, say Singapore can decide it wants to work with Puro and it wants to work with a project somewhere else, and they can use the Puro standard. So 6.2 is kind of working in parallel with the VCM. And then obviously what we do with the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, we're still figuring out how that works. But the standards that came out of that, we check against our methodologies and say, would we meet the standards set by the UN? This is really important to us, and we'll be going to issue that work quite soon. So we see that the voluntary carbon market and the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism and the CRCF, as you've been talking about, the carbon removal, carbon farming framework, they're all coalescing, they're all influencing each other. And yes, it's fragmented, and yes, it's complex, but it's great for the sector because it means it's more interest, and therefore we can scale. We have clear rules on how to supply. We have clear rules on how to buy. We're actually at a point where we are defining net zero in legislation. And sometimes you don't always realize when you're at a point in the political process. And that's why it feels complex. That's why it feels fragmented. Hopefully in 5 years, we'll look back at this moment and go, oh, crikey, that felt difficult. But it has to go through this process as we start to build the foundations for the legislation of this sector. Sebastian, did that make any sense?
It did, and actually I'd love to go back to you, Olga, and one thing that I'm curious about, because if we think about these new methodologies that you will need to analyze, for example, coming from the VCM, being submitted to you, hopefully plentiful very soon. And I see the question that came actually in the chat. How are you going to process that? Do you have the capacity to kind of go through it? And I'm asking because we're looking at this in CSCF in Europe, we had huge amount of resources for pretty long periods of time now to kind of work through what we have now, 3 draft methodologies. It was a really heavy process, right? So if I imagine 20 methodologies, 15 being submitted to you in the next couple of months, how will that work on your end to actually, go through them?
Well, first it goes through the methodological expert panel. There's one set up under the supervisory body. And they have the support of the UNFCCC Secretariat, which previously handled the CDM. So there are some resources there. I wouldn't know like how many. We don't know, but there are resources there. And there's also possibility, of course, to engage experts in addition. How exactly that would work, I wouldn't be able to tell you. There's always sort of the question of resource allocation and, you know, whether we get enough funding to do that. But, you know, unless there is actually tasks that we are not coping with, which is the department, the supervisory body, you know, it would be very hard to command more resources. It will take time. Like I can't, you know, I see questions asking, you know, how long will it take? It will take time. You know, the methodology, getting through a body, you know, based on, say, CDM experience, can take 1 to 2 years. So we need to be realistic about that as well. And maybe some methodologies will be very quick because we have been mandated by the Conference of Parties to prioritize methodologies of projects that are transitioning from CDM to 6.4. And there's also prioritization of standards. So that will probably take the best time of next year.
And do I get it right that these CDM transition ones, they're not removals, right? Or what type of projects are those? Like when you say we have to prioritize those methodologies, just for people in the room who are probably mostly interested in kind of carbon removals, would that include carbon removal methodologies, or is it primarily reductions?
I don't think so. I don't think so. If people are interested, there's actually a post on my LinkedIn, which I made a screenshot from the decisions of the supervisory body, which specific methodologies are being prioritized. Then maybe there'll be more that are being identified by the secretariat.
Okay.
But can I just ask a follow-up question? But we had a section in the Article 6.4 decision now on afforestation, reforestation, and how those will transition under CDM. So for afforestation, reforestation, I would have assumed that there would be removal projects there that would have to meet the criteria of the removal standards. But it looks like you think that those would be emission reduction projects, maybe.
Correct, but it's a good question. I'm not an expert, but if you go to the CDM website, I think there was either 1 or 2 afforestation, reforestation methodologies. So you go CDM, UNFCCC, and list of methodologies, and you will see how many there.
Yeah.
Okay, but then basically what I'm hearing is the next year at least you will be kind of busy with those first methodologies, and while in parallel many here will probably be submitting engineered carbon removal methodologies. It will probably take a few years until those actually get processed.
Right. I still think it's very important for stakeholders to start working through
absolutely,
you know, the procedural part of it and how you would do it, you know, how to read through all of the documents, because you might have questions, you know, and as you go through the process of preparing methodology for submission, you will learn a lot. You need to maybe cooperate with others and see how it has been done for others. I've seen a question on marine CDR, and I think something that I really need to emphasize about 6.4, which will have an impact on all our other standards as well, is that 6.4 made sustainable development to mandatory for all of the projects. So for projects that are affecting ecosystem, that are affecting environment, potentially one of the biggest questions that would need to be answered is the bigger impacts, because you'd need to look through that tool to understand what questions we're asking, and that will have to be verified as well for projects approval and for issuance of any units for transitioning projects as well.
I see that the obvious kind of elephant in the room that I see in the questions a lot is what will this do to demand? What will happen with buyers? All of that. We'll get there in a second. Before that, one thing that I did want to touch on that I've seen in kind of coverage of this is there, and again, I don't understand this fully, but the integrity of 6.2 vis-a-vis 6.4 and the quality of kind of those transactions. And what I've been reading, again, I'm not an expert, you're the experts here, is that in 6.4, we'll have a centralized standard that could guarantee a certain level of quality, whereas in 6.2, to put it bluntly, basically countries will do whatever they want. And that we won't really have consistency across what country A and B do versus what country C and D does, right? So I've been reading coverage that actually 6.2 could do a lot of damage if some very questionable projects get counted towards net zero goals. So I just wanted, before we move on to kind of the bigger demand bucket, I wanted to just talk about the integrity of kind of 6.2 in particular, because that seems a little bit more of a hot topic. So yeah, I don't know if Eve or someone else here wants to go, but I'd love to understand what you think about it.
Oh, I can try to have a go. Of course, it's clear that 6.2 is much more flexible because, as you said, two countries or more can come together and decide to collaborate how they want, the types of projects that they want, using the methodologies that they choose, and so on. And this is also the place where currently the infrastructure of the voluntary carbon market is being used, because carbon market standards like Puro and like others can be used in this context. I think what we're all hoping for is that when we now have the 6.4 up and running, to the extent that it will have methodologies approved under it, that these UN methodologies would in a way kind of show what is the right level of robustness that methodologies should have that are used for trading between countries. But of course, Paris Agreement, a bottom-up system, that's how we have the 6.2 operating the way it does. What we probably will see is the way a range of stakeholders keeping carbon markets at large, kind of in check with all kinds of first front page news items on projects that are not robust enough. That scrutiny will continue and will also apply if there are projects being used in 6.2 that don't really meet the expectations these days, because we will have 6.4 methodologies, but we also have all the voluntary market institutions like ICBCM, VCMI, but especially ICBCM CCPs that should be also guiding a lot of what happens when governments end up using voluntary market methodologies under 6.2. But it's clear that there's going to be much more flexibility there. That's what I would say on this. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
I can add that this was one of the big issues that was really countries have struggled with is how do you ensure equivalent standards under 6.2, and also we've had these arguments for a very long time, also among the negotiators on what is integrity, and is when you say banana, does it mean that it's the EU style of where the curvature is predetermined? But you can have different kinds of bananas, right? But as long as it's a banana, you can prove it's a banana. But how do you prove that it's a banana? So this was why it took so long. There was an idea to do it through registries. In the end, I think that was, this you might have seen in 6.2, this wasn't done through registries. But I think where you can expect is that at least, when it's government to government transactions, there'll be decisions between governments, and obviously governments take, they're liable, responsible. At least they have definitely get reputational risk. sort of what they approve. And when it comes to, say, voluntary markets that are operating through 6.2, and want to get their units correspondingly adjusted for the sake of avoiding double counting, there, I do think that ICVCM, as Eva mentioned, is going to play a leading role in determining, what is good standard and what's not. At the same time, I think it's also very important to say that, there are different opinions, of how things should be done and why they should be done. So I would encourage those that, feel very strongly about like what they're doing and why it's important to not be afraid to try to sort of defend methodologically, robustly defend what they're doing. Because opinions vary. Some people think it has to be absolutely just permanent, durable CDR. Others think, that, what is what is permanence? There's no agreement internationally what should be permanence, right? So these kind of things, that they can vary, and they are really driven by different opinions. And that can vary between the standards, that can vary between 6.4 and ICVCM and between other standards. So that plurality should exist, absolutely.
And can I have a question that I want to put to Helen in a second, but before that, actually, because you brought it up, I do want to go one level deeper on one thing that you said, Olga, which I know matters to a lot of people on this call, which is the durability topic in Article 6.4. Because as far as I understand, there's no differentiation really between less and more durable carbon removal within 6.4, and there's also been a bunch of scientific papers lately how this could actually be quite dangerous for net zero targets. If, for example, we only use short-lived removals to offset long-lived emissions, right? So how are you thinking about durability, potentially differentiating between durability within Article 6.4?
I would encourage people to read the standard on activities involving removals, because that formulates the approach to durability, and that is 6.4 is agnostic. There'll be risk assessments and buffer contributions based on risk assessment. And monitoring has to be continued. Post-crediting monitoring has to be continued until either the risk has been assessed as negligible, or whether it's been mitigated through a buffer contribution. And that's any potential future risk of reversal. And that remains to be seen what the interpretation of that is. But it comes from some other schemes. I wouldn't elaborate because there's constructive ambiguity. But it comes from some other schemes, actually not even standards, but from other schemes where this principle operates.
And if I can add to what Olga just outlined. So obviously Article 6 is technology agnostic or technology neutral, as we like to say, right? In the CDR community. When I read the 6.4 standard that now was agreed or noted or whatever vocabulary we use, I understand the path taken was to treat all removals equally. But the way I read it, the rules there on post-crediting monitoring, how the potential future reversals have to be remediated. In my view, whilst the standard currently is technology neutral, it actually might not look very desirable for less durable removals because of all these conditions that have been introduced in there. For some reason, it doesn't get that much attention. I have highlighted to it in some occasions, but the way I read it, This is the question I have, and I'm surprised more people haven't asked it openly so far.
Eva, this is a very good observation. I think from what I know, some people have noticed that. You know, it is we will see more how it evolves with sort of other supporting standards. And you know, there's one thing that that I should reflect on is that, you know, and by the way, just for the sake of clarity, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not presenting the supervisory body as a whole. And as personally as a member, you know, my observation is that, you know, we have a lot of you know, people are acting in their capacity, but they come with a background and with how it's done in their countries and some of the sort of policy positions that maybe have been internalized by the members coming from where they're coming from. So there've been definitely very different opinions on how that should have been treated. And maybe if the composition of the supervisory body changes, that can change as well.
Yeah, and just to add on that, because we did, you know, look at the standard before going to COP. And I think, and if I've understood Eva's point correctly, when you're looking at how it treats durable CDR, it says, you know, as Olga mentioned, there's different risk of reversal in there, which is really important. Activities have different risks of reversals. And for this standard to recognise that, I think is very important for the methods that we have here. And therefore, if you have a different risk of reversal, there's different ways that you need to do post-crediting monitoring and things like that. And that's really important to see in a standard for the 6.4 mechanism, for the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So we welcome that and look forward to seeing how it develops.
And last question, and maybe if I can keep going with you, Helen, and then I do want to move to demand and buyers because I know that's very interesting for folks. But there was a question from Nick who asked about, I didn't quite understand. So do we need to certify using a specific methodology like Puro's for biochar? And does Article 6.4 and 6.2 also certify Puro's methodology in turn? Do you maybe just want to elaborate?
I'll take a bit and then I'll pass to Olga. So as we just because we got 6.4 expert on here, so I'm not going to speak to 6.4. 6.2, so trade between two governments or trade into what we call other international mitigation purposes, i.e. the aviation market, or maybe in the future the maritime market, because international aviation and international maritime emissions are outside of the Paris Agreement, bizarrely. They can use the standards of the voluntary carbon market. They can also use government-led standards. So you see a mixture being used nowadays. And in the graphic, the link that I sent from the International Emissions Trading Association, you can see which countries are currently using that mechanism. And then I'll pass over to Olga for 6.4, please.
Well, I mean, for 6.2 and 6.4. 6.2, the permanence, you know, there's a requirement now to indicate in the information about your corporate approach how you're dealing with permanence. And 6.4, it's a risk assessment. But maybe if I didn't exactly catch the question, apologies.
And I think we addressed the second point earlier, which was that Puro will submit methodologies to 6.4, and then in future they might become part of the 6.4 standards. I wanted to move on to demand, just because I've seen a lot of different reactions to this lately, where basically people went all the way from this is a game changer for voluntary carbon market and for demand's going to increase now in the voluntary carbon market to actually it doesn't really matter. Like nothing's going to change now. The rationale for buyers to buy carbon removal right now has not really changed. And so, yeah, into this round, like what's your read? Like what happened at COP now mean for, let's face it, the main market we currently have for durable removals, which is the voluntary carbon market. So yeah, curious to get your take.
Crystal ball gazing. Okay. So, Sebastian, if I could predict the future, I wouldn't be a lobbyist. I'd be a trader. So that will definitely mean whatever I say is completely wrong. So your question was, what does this mean for the VCM? Yeah? Well, it's a good thing. But I am part of the VCM, so I'm always going to talk up my book. It's great that projects have the opportunity to use standards from the VCM to work with the 6.4 mechanism. Optionality is really important. And then what I'm really looking forward to next year is what demand signals are we going to see? You know, in the data from the International Emissions Trading Association, we're only seeing 7 countries buying. So what I really want to see and what I picked up at COP was more countries are going, what is the role? How do I use Article 6? How do I use what we call international credits? Now we're going to see a next round of nationally determined contributions, national pledges coming in, hopefully February onwards. And in those nationally determined contributions, it talks about which countries want to use Article 6 and how they want to use that to meet their targets. Again, it doesn't differentiate, so it's all types of mitigation, but it gives you an indication of which countries are wanting to use these mechanisms. So I'm always going to be positive and proactive. The VCM continues to learn from Article 6.4, and we all coalesce and hopefully we build demand. And I'll pass over to someone else to give a clearer prediction. Thank you.
Maybe I can add a bit more on sort of the differences between different parts of Article 6 and VCM. I think you know, for 6.4, there's opportunity to go through corresponding adjustments with authorized units, and you have the mitigation contribution units, the non-authorized units, that stay within the country. So theoretically, there is a possibility that say in developing countries, sort of mid-income developing countries, can allow for 6.4 units to be used in their domestic systems, either through emission trading or carbon tax, whatever it is. We don't know yet. That would be very welcome demand signal. And then I'm sure for those actors, stakeholders that are working in these countries, you know, it would be a great push. From developed countries, I don't think there's going to be more demand coming before 2040, because we kind of know, you know, the NDC have been submitted, they've been pushed by the NGOs not to offset their emissions. So all countries are trying to meet their targets domestically. Majority of them, let's majority of them, right? To the extent that they can. From corporates, I think there'll be a difference, because if the corporates based in Europe, there'll be push for them to have to go through correspondingly adjusted units to avoid double counting if they're making any sort of claims. If they're not making claims, and this is pure mitigation contribution from them to the developing world, you know, or to their own countries, because they can be contributing to the NDCs of their own countries, or where the countries where they're operating, you know, that would be a different story. But if they want to avoid double counting, they would have to use correspondingly adjusted units. And I think it'll be a very different story for the US. If US does not stay in the Paris Agreement, but I think none of Article 6 would be relevant to anybody operating inside the US with US-based remotes.
Before Sebastian moves us to the US topic, I'll add how I think about the impact on VCM of Article 6. And also, yeah, the question around the demands. Well, I've been getting this question a lot. What does it mean for VCM? And to some extent, I'm not really sure how much that should be a question in itself, because Article 6 is supposed to help enhance ambition. Obviously, there are some places where it touches with VCM, and we've discussed those here today as well. But it's mostly about this international compliance market between countries. And anyone who works on carbon markets also agrees that VCM plays an important role. It's a great piloting and testing ground for all kinds of new activities in either emission reductions or removals. But eventually, what we really need to get to scale on markets is different types of compliance markets, be it carbon crediting or emissions trading. So when we talk about the impact on VCM today of Article 6 and this full rulebook that we got out of COP29, in my view, it really depends on what do you mean? That would be my question back. Do you mean project developers? Do you mean standards? Do you mean corporates for buying? Because it impacts all of them very differently. As Helen very rightly said, project developers have another potential demand source. Marketplaces potentially could have no charter credits that come to their marketplace. Then corporates potentially have to compete with governments to buy certain credits. That's different. For standards, again, they operate in parallel. Of course, they can learn from each other, from the best practices, but that's the reality. And then you have verifiers, and you can basically go through the whole group of different stakeholders in VCM and then get very different answers regarding what the impact actually looks like.
It's been really, really helpful. And what I'm hearing, kind of also to just let me know if I got this right or wrong, is again, for suppliers, so people who are creating credits, there might actually be through 6.2 more demand coming now from governments. And for corporates, from what I'm hearing, is there might be more competition, but for credits, but there's not necessarily going to be a big impact on whether corporates will buy or not. Like this is something, because I know this is something that has been debated, but from what I'm hearing here, nothing in what happened will directly impact necessarily the willingness of the decision making of corporates to buy. And obviously in a few years, we might have corresponding adjustments that corporates could buy to avoid double counting issues. But again, this is a bit further down the line. Is that accurate? Would you say anything I just said is wrong or not accurate? Because I know that this is something that's really important to a lot of folks on the call.
Maybe, coming from 6.4 viewpoint, I think maybe it would be a lot easier for corporates to buy 6.4 units. Because they would be, at least they'll have the UN stamp of approval, right? Mm-hmm. And UN, and I think 6.4 would be very, very hard to get through 6.4 from what I'm seeing. And so potentially, because, we've been on a learning curve, right? From even before CDM, there's activities implemented jointly, then there was CDM, then we had the independent standards, right? And now we have Article 6, 6.4, so it's an evolution. And so definitely there's going to be, more, there will be more oversight. And hopefully less issues that we've been experiencing before. So it's kind of, for those corporates that are afraid of buying because they are afraid of being on the front page of The Guardian, being criticized for what they bought, with the UN units, at least they could say, well, but, we bought the best that it possibly was. There was UN units. But then it's whether the same applies to 6.2, I'm not sure. And whether the corporates actually follow the process enough to understand the difference, and I'm also not sure.
Thanks, Olga. And I guess with 4 minutes to go, kind of starting to wrap up, looking ahead, I know there were a lot of questions around countries. So I guess two ways if you want to go. One is, what do you think will happen with potentially the US, leaving the Paris Agreement, potentially leaving the UNFCCC. But I think, Olga, you kind of answered it, I think, which means, Article 6 won't really apply to them anymore to countries who leave. That was my read, but feel free to elaborate on that. And the final thing is, if from all of you, a brief one on COP30. If taking everything we've just said, what are you thinking about when you're thinking about how we prepare for COP30, what will have to get done there, just as an outlook for folks? Again, 1 minute each or something, if you just want to share some final thoughts. Whoever wants to go first.
Maybe I can start with the whole leaving the Paris Agreement situation. I saw a question whether the Argentina leaving the COP, leaving the conference, or withdrawing a delegation from an event. It doesn't have any legal repercussions other than that delegation doesn't get anything to say in that particular event. It's more fundamental if a party withdraws from the Paris Agreement, because then Article 6 doesn't apply. Article 6 is under Paris Agreement. Within that party, inside that party, nothing really happens. If you've had, say, VCM market and the producers inside that country and buyers inside that country, but nothing changes. So if there was an export of units planned through Article 6, or say CORSIA, for any kind of mechanisms that required corresponding adjustments, that would have an implication, because a country that's not party to the Paris Agreement cannot effect, we call, right, corresponding adjustments. So that would make a cross-border transaction impossible. If that cross-border transaction was meant to be under Article 6. And UNFCCC, well, it's even more profound, but that is just it's more profound implications how you can possibly return to the convention. But I wouldn't go to that. It's enough just to withdraw from Paris Agreement, not to make Article 6 impossible.
Thank you, Olga. And then, maybe Eva and Helen, very brief, COP30. What is your priority when you're thinking about preparing for it?
It's the ambition COP. So now that we have the Article 6 rulebook in place, maybe it's too soon to expect it to impact already what the next round of NDCs will look like to come in. But Article 6 is designed to increase ambition. So now that this tool is available, we would want countries to use it. We want Article 6 to mobilize those billions, potentially trillions, I've seen AITA studies, to help increase climate ambition. So yes, I think all eyes on NDCs, and especially making sure if there is any way of impacting that the future NDCs, the way they're structured, would also get more speak on how removals are included there and which types of removals.
Excited for 2025. Do we have no Article 6 negotiations on the agenda? Do we have a break until 2028? Or there'll be implementation items. So passing over to colleagues and friends in Brazil. The NDC point is all about this. And, it's not just COP, it's the whole year that we work. So looking forward to looking at the implementation of the Article 6.4 mechanism, progressing the EU's carbon removal certification framework, working with Japan, working around the world really as legislators start to take removals more seriously and look at them in compliance markets. So, Sebastian, that's what I'm looking at, transition plans and compliance markets. Thanks.
Jason, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Olga, Eva, and Helen, for an excellent discussion. Thank you to our audience. We can't do this without you. To that end, we have some links in the chat that I just put in there. First off, the LinkedIn contact information for all our speakers today, for one. Two, how do we do today? We'd love to hear in a post-event survey. You'll also receive that in an email. Third, preview. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have our year-end celebration, not the Emmys, not the Grammys, but the Carbies. So feel free to come to that, to be in community with other fellow AirMiners about what 2024 meant for you and how we can chart forward for 2025.